Okay, welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us for this webinar via Conservation Commons on the Smithsonian for Earth Optimism Week. We're going to be starting here on Monday, kicking the week off, helping to kick the week off, and I will be your first speaker. So my name is Lacher. I am the host of this event. I'm a landscape ecologist and owner of Seven Bends Nursery, located in the northern Shenandoah Valley region of Virginia. I am really excited about the lineup that we have today, as each talk will contribute to a larger story about native plants and our relationship with them. I'll get us started by setting the scene for why we are all here. So we live in a beautiful place with a global legacy of life. There is an estimated 1.8 million species on Earth that have evolved over millions of years. The value of this diverse sea of life is endless and is represented in our cultures, economies, and general livelihoods. The web of interactions that species and non-living components of Earth make up the biosphere, or the global geologic system. Each component of this system is dependent on one another in order to sustain life, including human life on Earth. Now, we know now that our quality of life is tightly connected to the environmental health of where we live. We need these species in order to sustain the function of ecosystems that are essential to our well-being. So there are a couple of definitions here. Ecosystem function is defined as the capacity of ecosystems to provide goods and services that satisfy human needs, either indirectly or directly. And ecosystem services. This is the many and varied benefits to humans that are provided by the natural environment and from healthy ecosystems. So some examples of ecosystem services include clean and abundant fresh water, recreation, carbon storage, pollination, and productive soils, among many others. Unfortunately, humans are having a huge impact on our world. And humanity's impact is everywhere. It's not just in our presence, but it's how we behave. Whether through direct or indirect means, we are forever changing the face of our landscape, bringing us into the age of the Anthropocene. Now, this map illustrates the global impact as measured by the human footprint. Human footprint represents a combination of the built environment, agriculture, population density, transportation, and light pollution. The impact of this human footprint is that we are losing biodiversity fast. And this is resulting in the devastating losses of species. With this, we also lose the function of these ecosystems and the services that they provide. And we can see our impacts happening in our own backyards, right before our eyes. This here is an image from Google Earth of the Washington metro area between the years 1984 and 2016. You can see how rapidly land use has eroded the landscape of forest cover, replacing it with concrete developments and subdivisions. These land use practices contribute to the degradation of services locally. And this is an important point because it signals that we have some power individually to make also a positive impact. Our individual choices, they also matter. Therefore, if we can join together to implement policy and practice that serve to protect species, we can also protect the function of ecosystems and thus the services that they provide. So, how can we, as individuals, be better stewards of our landscapes? Now I'm going to bring us back to the ecosystem function, ecosystem services idea, pictured here with an eastern deciduous forest. Here is the function that is sustained by the interaction of all living and non-living things. The service is water. So this forest system is responsible for maintaining the production of the service. Now, introducing native plants onto the landscape is one way that we can contribute to the restoration of ecological systems in our own backyards. Now, I'm sure that many of you attending this seminar or the symposium are already familiar with the idea and definition of native plants, but I'm going to provide a quick overview for the rest of us. Native plants are defined as those that occur naturally in a region in which they evolved. There are several important considerations when determining what is native and what plant. These questions include Was this plant grown from local stock, or does the plant have a local origin? What is the source of this plant? And is this plant native to my particular region? There are plants native to Virginia, North Carolina, etc. But what about where I live? Am I gardening in close proximity to a natural area? And is my planting for restoration? So all of these questions are important considering the kinds of plants that you would select or introduce onto the landscape on which you live. Now again, more specifically, how do we go from traditional gardening practices with horticultural varieties of plant species to gardening with native plants in order to improve or protect ecologic function? Well, the answer in part is right in front of us. We can learn to read systems, looking for visual cues that signal to us that the system is maintaining some function. I'm going to start with and give you an overview of a few of the larger, more common habitat types or ecosystem types within the state of Virginia and the mid-Atlantic. I'm going to start with forests. So forests are an ecosystem service powerhouse. Forests provide carbon sequestration, soil productivity, pollination, clean air, and clean water and abundant resources. Now, there are several features that I look for in a healthy forest. You can focus on multiple forms of diversity, such as species diversity, functional diversity, genetic diversity, and then also above, below ground linkages, because it is an entire system operating both within what you can see and what you cannot necessarily see. I also look for the diversity in stand age. So is there a large diversity in the age of trees? This can kind of be determined by the size of these trees. Canopy level diversity, and I'll talk about this in a minute, and the presence or, ideally the absence of invasive plants. Here's a couple of diagrams that give you a sense of what I would look for when out in the forest in terms of canopy level diversity and vertical structure. So on the left image here, you can see that they've labeled 5 different categories. You start with the canopy, which is the highest point of the forest. You've got lower canopy trees. This could be a mix of redbuds and dogwood species, understory trees and shrubs, and then also ground cover, so ferns, herbaceous plants, etc. Here's another diagram that illustrates the structure in a transitional edge between forest and grasslands, or even your lawn. This is something that you could easily mimic via native plantings. So you see here on the left, you've got the lawn transitioning into perennials and grassland species. So those are a little bit lower structure, perennials and shrubs, moving over to smaller trees and larger shrubs, oaks, hickories, maple, you're getting the canopy species here. And then if you wanted to put in, some sort of pathway through your forest, this kind of canopy with the horizontal branching, large shade species help to actually limit the additional establishment of invasive species. I'm going to include a few photos to point out structure. So here you can see this ground cover, herbaceous plants, smaller trees, species, seedlings that are starting to come up. You can see the smaller, shorter canopy structure there in the back. And then what you don't see in the picture is the really tall canopy. But this, to me, you're starting to see some of this vertical structure of forests. Here's an example of a couple of herbaceous or ground cover species. Looks like some lady fern and then orchids. Now, as a side point, with the Smithsonian, I've been working to develop an orchid field survey to kind of address the question if species like orchids could be used as early indicators of changes in forest health due to surrounding land use change. Here's another image that illustrates the importance of ground cover. So leaf litter is really important, deciduous leaves here for soil health, moisture retention, and then also habitat for many forest creatures. And finally, I want to point out the importance of fallen logs as a natural and essential component of healthy forests, providing habitat again for many forest creatures, including insects. Now on to grasslands. People often think about forests as being important for carbon storage, but in fact, grasslands contribute to this essential service as well. You can see here that many species of grasslands, herbaceous plants and grasses have long roots that actually act as carbon storage within the soil. The diversity of plant life in meadows and grasslands contribute to diverse structure both above and below ground, with grasslands providing benefits via soil productivity, pollination, agriculture, and also, like I said, carbon storage. Now moving on to streams and rivers. This is the obvious source of fresh water for both human use and recreation. This diagram right here illustrates the structure of a freshwater stream and the multiple habitats that are considered as a part of this system, whether they are aquatic or terrestrial. And this is why a healthy river is also the product of a healthy riverbank, and why you hear of the importance of protecting riparian areas or the land that exists beside the waterway. So now, woody debris in stream serve as an important role in stream systems. Large woody debris helps slow the flow of water, making it easier for adult fish to move upstream and for juveniles to rear. This in turn helps them expend less of their limited and valuable energy, fighting strong currents. In restoration projects, large woody debris is also often spread across the floodplain to help slow water and reduce erosion during high water events. Gravel is an important material for salmon and steelhead, or here anadromous fish such as trout. Particle structure in sediment in stream matters in order for them to reproduce. Large woody debris can help decrease water temperature by providing shading areas along streams and creating pockets of cooler water for cold water-loving species. Woody debris also help trap organic material like leaves and twigs that provide nutrients for insects and invertebrates, which in turn provide food for the fish in these streams. The woody debris also helps stream banks by preventing erosion of soil along stream banks, and then pools of water and kind of steps or different speeds of water within the stream can provide habitat for fish during periods of low water flow. And then here's a photo illustrating a combination of forest structure. Here you've got the vertical structure from the canopy down to herbaceous cover on the ground. The diversity in plant life here, the idea of a riparian buffer all the way to the stream and outwards, and then this idea of fallen woody material within the stream itself. And then here we have some canoers enjoying the benefits of healthy waterways right outside our nursery on the North Fork of the Shenandoah River. So by observing the natural world and introducing natives in a way that contributes to improvements in ecosystem function, we can bring wildlife and joy into our own backyards. Now, one more point as I'm ending this talk. This effort is achievable, but it is not minor. This is an image of the protected land system in the United States. You can see on the West Coast, this is partially just due to economic and history of the United States, of how protected lands were put into place and established. And you can see that the East Coast is potentially at risk of further land degradation if we cannot do better at strategically planning conservation efforts. And this is a place where you can help. Your property can be just one component of a greater system if we all chip in. These diagrams illustrate the concept behind connectivity of landscapes, or connecting patches of habitat to one another via strategic planning. So if we think ahead of time of where we need to conserve habitat, to preserve particular ecosystem services and access to those services, to protect the movement of wildlife across landscapes, and also to improve resilience against climate change, we can prioritize the conservation of areas, or through your efforts, contribute to a greater landscape effort in protecting and making more habitat for this effort. So to end, the more of us that take part in this effort to plant natives, the better chance we have of achieving a paradigm shift. And I am telling you as a landscape ecologist that this is very possible. We can build literal bridges, connect people and landscapes, and also protect life. So thank you very much for attending. Please stay tuned for the lineup of excellent speakers we have for you today, and you can find me at sevenbends.org. Next up will be Dr. Doug Tallamy.
Okay, it is 1:15 and I'm going to start. I am Doug Tallamy, University of Delaware, and today I want to give you my idea of what nature's best hope for the future is. But first we have to review what nature is. It's really a series of very specialized interactions, largely between plants and animals. Not all the interactions are specialized, but most of them are. Specializations such as the relationship between jays and oaks. Jays are the primary disperser of acorns. The Baltimore checker spot depends on white turtlehead. I could talk all day about specialized relationships. The problem, though, is that today these relationships, nature itself, is on the ropes. And it's on the ropes because we have carved up the natural world into tiny remnants of its former self. And each one of those remnants is too small and too isolated from other such remnants to sustain the life that supports the ecosystems that we all depend on. Another reason that these interactions are on the ropes is because we have brought in more than 3,300 species of plants from other continents, which are very poor at sustaining these interactions. And many of our natural areas look like this. And of course, most of our unnatural areas, our managed landscapes, are loaded with plants from other continents as well. We use them as decorations. And it's one of the reasons we're seeing headlines like this. The insect apocalypse is here. What does it mean for the rest of life on Earth? Talking about global insect decline, followed by this scary one. North America's lost 3 billion birds in the last 50 years. That's a third of the North American bird population. And now the UN says, oh, we're going to lose 1 million species to extinction, possibly in the next 20 years. By the way, this is not an option, folks. This is not an option. We have to make sure that doesn't happen. Now, in the past, conservationists worked pretty much exclusively where there weren't a lot of people, in parks and preserves. And it's obvious that is not working today. So we now need to think about saving nature, actually reconstructing it where there are a lot of people outside of the parks and preserves, because that's pretty much everywhere. In other words, we have to find ways for nature to thrive in human-dominated landscapes, not hang on by a thread, but thrive. And that's a new goal. So we're talking about an ecological crisis here, and yeah, we've read that quite well. It's global, but it has a grassroots solution. The solution is you and me and how we treat the land around us. So where should we start? If you own land, think about your yard as a beginning place. You know, 85% of the US east of the Mississippi is privately owned, and about 75% of the entire country is privately owned. If we don't do conservation on private property, we're going to fail, because otherwise we're focused on areas that are too small and too isolated to support the species that we need them to support. So what we want to do is reconstruct. Most of our yards do not have very healthy natural ecosystems. So we got to rebuild nature right where we live, where we work, where we play. But to do that, we have to, not all species contribute to ecosystem function equally. So we have to choose the species that are most important, the building blocks. Otherwise, it's not going to work. And there are two building blocks that are essential. We certainly have to have flowering plants. They're capturing energy from the sun and turning it into food. And in order to have those flowering plants, you have to have the pollinators that allow those flowering plants to reproduce. All right, that's one group. But now we've got the energy from the sun as food in plant leaves. We have to get that to the animals that need it. And most vertebrates, for example, don't eat plants directly. They eat something that ate plants. That something typically is insects, but it turns out that caterpillars are transferring more energy from plants to other animals than any other type of plant eater. So when we're reconstructing nature, we have to make sure we're building landscapes that include a lot of caterpillars, or again, we will have a failed food web. So how do we add caterpillars to our yards? Well, we add them by adding the plants that make caterpillars. There is a catch, and that is that most plants don't make a lot of caterpillars. So we have to be fussy about it. And we have to be fussy about it because the caterpillars themselves are very fussy. And the monarch butterfly illustrates that perfectly. You can have all the Asian ornamentals you want in your yard, and you won't create any new monarch butterflies at all. The only thing that's going to make a monarch butterfly is milkweed. And monarchs are not special. That's called host plant specialization. 90% of the insects that eat plants are host plant specialists. So we have to include the plants that they specialize on. All I'm saying here is that plant choice matters. If we're going to reconstruct food webs where we humans are dominating the planet now, we've got to choose the right plants or it's not going to work. There are 4 things we want to think about if we're going to succeed. And the first one is we have to shrink the area that's in lawn, because we've got a lot of lawn. We've got more than 40 million acres of lawn nationwide. That is an area bigger than New England. And of course, lawn is a status symbol, but it's an ecological dead zone. So I'm not suggesting we get rid of lawn. We have to keep our status symbols, but I do want to cut the area in half. Let's put some important plants in the half that we take out of lawn. We'll still manicure the part of lawn that we have, and we'll still show our neighbors that we are good citizens. But if we take half the area out of lawn, we can create a new national park. That'll be 20 million acres in size. And if we do it at home, we can call it Homegrown National Park. And it'll be bigger than the Adirondacks, plus Yellowstone, plus Yosemite, plus Grand Tetons, Canyonlands, Mount Rainier, North Cascades, Badlands National Park, Olympic National Park, Sequoia National Park, plus the Grand Canyon, plus Denali, which is huge, plus the Great Smoky Mountains. You add up all those parks, still less than 20 million acres. So Homegrown National Park will be the biggest park in the country. Okay. First thing we're going to do is shrink the lawn. The second thing we need to do is to, the area we're going to replace, we're going to remove the lining. We've got to put plants that, at least some of them, I'm calling keystone plants. Now remember the Roman arch, this is what a Roman arch is. The keystone is the stone in the middle of that arch. And if you take that stone out of the arch collapses. Well, I'm calling these keystone plants because if we take them out of the local food web, the food web collapses. And that's because all keystone plants, by the way, are native plants, but not all native plants are keystone plants. There's just 5% of our native plants that are making 75% of that caterpillar food that drives the food webs. 14% of our native plants are making 90% of the food, the caterpillar food that drives those food webs. So think of these plants. Let's say you're building an ecological house in your yard. Think of keystone plants as being the 2x4s of that house. If you don't include them, the house falls down. You cannot build a house out of wallpaper. They're not the only thing that's going to go in your house, but they're essential. The top keystone plant in 84% of the counties of North America, it would be one of the oak species. There's no other genus that comes close to this in terms of ecological power. In the mid-Atlantic states, they support 557 species of caterpillars, which is 557 species of bird food, over 950 species of caterpillars nationwide. All right, we're going to shrink the lawn. We're going to add keystone plants. We're going to bring a lot of insects into our yard. And then we're going to kill them with our security light, which of course is not the goal. There's a lot of research coming out of Europe that suggests security lights or light pollution at night in general is one of the major drivers of global insect decline, which actually is good news to me. We have to turn around insect decline. And if it's as easy as turning out our lights, that makes the job doable. But I know what you're going to say. You can't turn out the light on your garage because the bad man will come. All right, put a motion sensor on it. So it only turns on when the bad man does come. And the first thing you're going to discover is the bad man doesn't come very often. And if you don't want to do that, take the white bulb out of your security light and put in a yellow bulb. A yellow LED bulb is the least attractive to nocturnal insects. If we were to switch out our white lights at night for yellow lights, particularly yellow LED lights, we would save billions of insects every night and billions of dollars as well, because they're certainly a lot more energy efficient. Fourth thing we need to do is to landscape in a way that allows these caterpillars, those crucial parts of our food webs, to complete their development. And this is something we're just starting to think about. But most caterpillars develop on a tree or a plant. They complete their growth, but then they drop off that tree and they wheel themselves beneath the ground and form a pupa underground, or they spin a cocoon in the leaf litter that is under the tree. And that's the problem. There is no leaf litter under the tree, and we mow and compact our soil so tough that a caterpillar cannot get underground there. And you all know this is the way we landscape pretty much everywhere, which makes it an ecological trap. Our moths come in, lay their eggs, the caterpillars grow, and then drop down and die. This is what most people do. They have a tree and a big lawn. Nobody's measured how well caterpillars survive in a situation like this, but I guarantee they will survive better in a situation like this, where you have a tree and then a layered landscape, maybe a dogwood here and a native azalea and then ferns and ground cover. They drop down into a safe zone. The soil is not compacted. They can easily get beneath the ground to pupate, or they can spin a cocoon in the leaf litter that is under here. Caterpillar survivorship will be much higher if we treat the areas around our trees like this. And it's also the way we should shrink the lawn. We put big beds around our trees. You know, for some reasons, we've left Earth stewardship to just a few specialists, a few ecologists, a few conservation biologists. We did not see it as an inherent responsibility of every human being on the planet. But I don't know why, because every human being on the planet depends entirely on the quality of Earth's ecosystem. So why wouldn't everybody bear the responsibility for good Earth stewardship? It doesn't mean that you have to save biodiversity for a living, but you can save it where you live. And if you do, it empowers you. Right now, there's so many people that feel powerless in terms of their relationship with the Earth. The Earth's problems are huge, and it really does seem like one person can't make a difference at all. But in this case, the cliche is accurate. One person can make a difference. Go outside, shrink your lawn, put in a pollinator garden, take out your invasive plants, and use keystone plants. And you will see your local ecosystem just blossom, as it were. It will come alive, and that makes you an important cog in the future wheel of conservation. It also shrinks the problem down to something that's manageable for each one of us. Again, don't think about the entire planet's problems. Just worry about your little piece of the planet. If you own property, that's certainly where you're going to start. If you don't own property, you're not left out. You can help somebody who does. You can volunteer for a land conservancy. You can help a park or a preserve. All of them are underfunded. All of them are understaffed. They will love you. So as property owners or as volunteers, each one of us has the power and the responsibility to fix dead landscapes like this. Whether or not we determine to do so is going to determine nature's fate and then ultimately our own fate. So in fact, you are nature's best hope. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Doug. That was amazing. Next, we have Betsy Von Hull, PhD Program Director, Long-Term Research in Environmental Biology, Population and Community Ecology Cluster.
Good afternoon, and thanks so much for all who are joining us. And thanks to the previous speakers who have really kind of set a good stage for what I'm going to talk about, which is a project that I worked on with a couple of collaborators to look at the potential for using landscape scale or large scale restoration to mitigate the effects of climate change. And as Iara said, I am from the National Science Foundation. Okay, and so this picture is just a really good illustration about how plants have responded to climate change so far. And you can see the picture on the left is a leaf out at the Lowell Cemetery in Lowell, Massachusetts. And you can see on the picture on the right, the leaf out that occurred 137 years later. And you can see on the left, there is no leaf out. And then on the same day of the year, 137 years later, there is full leaf out occurring. And so on average in Massachusetts, leaf out is occurring 11 days earlier. And this study is anything but isolated. We've seen literally over 100,000 studies that have documented species responding to climate change. And they're all, for the most part, most responding in the same way. Species are shifting poleward, on average 6.1 kilometers per decade. And they're leafing out or doing something different and usually an earlier way. So for example, birds are nesting earlier, and that's 2.3 days per decade. And so we're seeing lots of changes across the landscape. And so one of those changes that hits close to home for many of us is when's the last time, think about the last time you saw a monarch. In the West, the migratory population of monarch butterflies is collapsing. And this could be due from land use, climate, parasites, pesticide use, and this is an area of active research. Last year, the yearly count of monarch butterflies overwintering in Mexico, and that's the population that goes through the eastern United States, declined by half. And that is actually the count that's well below the threshold what government scientists predict that the migration could collapse. And so that's in other words, you could not see migrating butterflies coming through, flittering through your yard and potentially landing on a milkweed that you have planted in your yard if the numbers collapse to such low levels. And so this eastern monarch collapse is attributed to poor weather conditions during that spring and fall migration of 2020, but also monarchs have lost an estimated 165 million acres of breeding habitat in the United States, and that's due to herbicide spraying and development. This is not the only species that's changing and in the previous case collapsing. Some species, like I had mentioned earlier, are shifting poleward. And this is the example of the Cape May warbler, which is projected to shift northward. And I'm bringing this up because it's a bird species that summers in northern spruce woods, but then winters in the Caribbean. And so it has different types of food sources. In the summer, it eats insects, but during the migration in the winter, it really varies its diet between nectar from flowers and from juice from piercing fruit. And so this is a species that's eating both fruit and basically plants, as well as insect species, and which of course is affected by these declines that we're seeing in some parts of the world of insect species that Dr. Tallamy mentioned in the previous presentation. And so this is a really critical slide that many of these plants and animals are going to really need to move large distances in order to track climate change. But fragmentation, so in other words, if there's a city that it gets in the way or a highway that gets in the way, is going to limit the movement of species to be able to shift northward with climate change. So this was a very interesting study that looked at fragmentation patterns or those barriers such as development that inhibit species from shifting northward. And they found that only 41% of the natural areas on the West Coast have enough connectivity between these natural areas to allow plants and animals to shift with the climate as the climate warms. Worst case scenario, or the East Coast only has 2% of the natural areas that are sufficiently connected. And so some of these activities that Dr. Tallamy mentioned, such as planting things in your yard, will help facilitate these shifts of species over time with climate change. And so I mentioned earlier that plants are responding to climate change by shifting their reproductive, what is called their phenology, timing of reproduction, when they leaf out and when they produce fruits. And what they have shown in the UK is that native species that respond to climate in this way, in a positive way, are actually better range expanders as well. So there's lots of little pieces of information that we're kind of bringing together to understand how species are responding to climate change. And so lots of different people, researchers have been writing about this. And one of these papers have really kind of pointed managers, people that manage natural areas, that they should be prepared both for the expansion, but also the contraction of non-native plants due to global change. And that will give us a really interesting and potentially really big opportunity for restoration at the landscape scale. And specifically, these landscapes or these locations where disturbance is really driving the invasion may be the best places and the best opportunities for restoration, because the native species may be able to resist the non-native species that are potentially sweeping across the country. And so how will climate change alter our ability to restore habitats effectively? I mean, for one, we know that interactions with species, including species that live in the soil, species that compete with the plants or facilitate the plants, and predators, are also going to be altered by climate change. And that is going to affect native plant range expansion over time. And also we know that different species are expanding and shifting their ranges at different levels and different rates. And that actually may be differing by their status. So in other words, rare species may need more assistance, so to speak. So restoration opportunities that occur in areas where non-native species are retreating, we really need to do more research in terms of understanding what benefits the natives, especially with in relation to the non-native species at your site. And also we do know that these intact, undisturbed soils, these areas which are very, considered normally natural areas, or that haven't been, private lands that haven't been disturbed, that these are really areas that we want to foster native species in order to resist invasion across the landscape and allow these species to shift their ranges over time. And the other thing we do also know is that, and this is a very active area of research, is that soil microorganisms are really important for restoration. And so I have been speaking a lot about landscape scale restoration, so I want to quickly define that. That is ecological restoration efforts that incorporate landscape level processes. In other words, that incorporate the ability and to be able to document the ability for species to shift across the landscape. And these are restorations that areas that can include these large contiguous areas or even fragmented areas, but they are at or above 1 kilometer square in area. And so there have been lots of global initiatives thinking about landscape level restoration. The Bond Challenge occurred in 2011, and that's a global initiative to look at, bring over 150 million hectares of the world's deforested and degraded lands into restoration by 2020, and 350 million hectares by 2030. And so although these landscape level restoration efforts are gaining traction worldwide, the success of these restoration efforts and initiatives is unknown at this point in terms of, are they allowing species to shift across the landscape? And that will allow us to really understand the ecological mechanisms that are responsible for allowing these species to shift at the landscape. So in other words, that's, in summary from this slide, is that we need to really understand a lot more about the ecological mechanisms allowing species to shift across the landscape and the benefit of these landscape scale restorations. And so in the review article that I conducted with my collaborators, we found that only 9% of 477 articles that resulted from our search were studies of these landscape scale restorations. That's not a lot. So a lot more monitoring needs to be done. And then also we found that 73% of these landscape restorations were initiated in the last 30 years. And so this is something that has been gaining in popularity over the last 3 decades. And we also found that the majority of these landscape restorations are being conducted by one country, which is China, which has really initiated this starting in the 1970s. And they had a program in 1999, which was a huge program called the Grain for Green program. And they really focused on replacing degraded farmland across China with forested landscapes, with mixed results in terms of success, because some of these areas did plant non-native species across the landscape, which obviously has different effects on the biodiversity. And so why does landscape scale restoration help? It helps these species that are responding to climate change be able to move over time. It facilitates these range shifts. Again, plant species are expected to shift their ranges over 1 kilometer every year. And then it also helps these ecosystem functions. that Iara was talking about earlier. So that's water quality, nutrient retention, pollination, pest control, as well as regional climate regulation. And last, of course, by planting native across the landscape, that serves as a carbon sink to basically suck the atmospheric carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and then into the ground. And the paper that I'm referring to is listed at the bottom of this slide, and I'll put it in the chat later for if people would like to access it. So in conclusion for this project, 87% of these studies focused on the ecosystem functions, such as carbon uptake of these restored habitats, but only 13% focused on other impacts from the restoration, such as the number of species that were retained across these landscapes. So there's really a clear need for much more research and observations to be undertaken on the ecological outcomes of these landscape scale restorations to really understand whether or not they're able to enable species and communities to shift their ranges as the climate changes. And so part of what we did with this research is we provided a decision matrix tool for managers in order to understand where across the landscape they should put and target their restoration efforts in terms of the current and future climatic conditions, as well as the disturbance of that particular area that they're considering. So let's just quickly look at this figure that I showed earlier and the real dearth of connectivity, especially in the eastern United States. And so what can you do to help these species shift in terms of their response to climate change? There's this great paper, and I will also post this, the reference in the chat, that talks about 8 simple actions that people can use to save insects from global decline. And of course, many bird species are dependent on insects. And so these 8 actions can also be primarily also benefit birds and other animal species as well. And so number 1 is what Dr. Tallamy referred to in the previous presentation, is in order to create these insect-friendly habitats and also bird-friendly habitats, you could convert your lawn or part of your lawn, as he mentioned, into a diverse natural habitat. You can also plant natives instead of non-native species in your yard. If you're having your yard landscaped, for example, you could just ask the simple question, what native species can you place in my yard instead of these non-native alternatives? Or when you visit your local nursery, ask what native species are available if you don't have a native nursery nearby. And you can find out what species are native to your area by simply visiting native plant website. Most species, most states have native plant websites that list the species you can plant in your yard. Some of them list pollinators that are benefited from the native plants. And also some of these native plant guides will list, if you for example, wanted a non-native species in your yard and you want to know an alternative native species, that'll give you those alternate species as well. And then the third that they suggested is to reduce the pesticide and herbicide use in your yard or wherever you're helping in terms of the landscape. And this is the pictures on this slide are simply the pictures that I plant of species that I planted, native species in my yard, and just to show that I shop at these native sales as well as local native nurseries. And so by doing this, you could potentially help species be able to shift their ranges, and also migrating species to be able to make their way across the continent between their summer and their wintering ranges. And so last, I just want to acknowledge the collaborators that worked with me on this, Stephanie Jelinek and Elise Gornish, and Carla Cardwell, who helped with the design of this, and the pictures, the attribution of the pictures. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Betsy. That was wonderful. Next up, we're going to have Alan Weekly, co-author of Flora of Virginia, the director of UNC Herbarium, North Carolina Botanic Garden, University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill.
Yada, your sound isn't going. Try to restart it and then click the button at the bottom that says, it's like enable sound.
Hi, it's great to be with you all today to talk about understanding and conserving the Southeast's diverse flora. The Southeast has a tremendously diverse flora. This map from the Biota of North America program shows areas of concentration of the flora, of high diversity in the flora in California and then in many scattered parts of the southeastern US. If we jump up to the family level of taxonomic rank, we see that the Southeast is even more heavily weighted as an area of very high diversity at higher levels of taxonomic recognition. And if we look at tree diversity, we also see a pattern of the Southeast being an area of extremely high diversity. If we look at other organism groups like amphibians or reptiles or fish, we also see that there's a very high diversity in various parts of the southeastern United States. But when we think perhaps of a standard average landscape in the southeastern US, it may seem a bit dull and boring and not very diverse. It may look a little bit like this, lush and pleasant, but not suggesting tremendous diversity. And yet, when we look more closely at the landscape of the southeastern United States, we see tremendous diversity of habitat. And this diversity ranges from sandstone rock houses to longleaf pine, fire-maintained longleaf pine ecosystem, to granite flat rocks, to high elevation alpine boreal habitats at high elevations in the mountains. And we can sort of portray this this diversity as being the result of the four ancient elements: earth, air, fire, and water, but with the addition of kind of the crazy clock of time to those four elements. So variation in those elements, the physiographic variation, geologic variation here shown on a geologic map of Alabama, tremendously rich geologic diversity, elevation, diversity of elevation, and diversity of fire regimes, all added together with time, with past climate changes and so forth, moving things around, and yet with a basic underlying continuity of the Southeast never having been covered by glaciers, never having been covered by oceanic rise, available constantly for occupation by plants and animals. We see the elements that lead to a great diversity and a stable and resilient diversity. And we can see this resilient diversity in the species richness of rare and imperiled vascular plants, once again with this tremendous concentration in the southeastern and mid-Atlantic states of the United States. And I'm going to give you just a quick tour through some of that diversity to give you a feel for the diversity, where it comes from, and also, of course, I hope to have you appreciate the beauty and interest of some of the diversity. So Houstonia montana, the Roan Mountain bluet, occurs only in about a 6-county area near the North Carolina, Tennessee, Virginia tri-corner. Grows in small clumps with these brighter pink flowers. It's a relative of a fairly widespread southern species, Houstonia purpurea. Gentianopsis crinita in the southeast, a scattered disjunct species on particular rock substrates from a more continuous distribution in the northeastern United States and adjacent Canada. 3 sibling species of fire pinks, here with different habitats and different levels of abundance: the widespread Silene virginica, the rare Silene regia, the royal catchfly, and the isolated rockhouse catchfly, Silene rotundifolia. Vandenboschia boschiana, Bosch's filmy fern, is exemplary of a tropical component in the southeastern flora. And so when conditions were moister and hotter in the southeast, tropical species could move into the area, get stranded behind in specialized habitats, and diverge into their own species. So we have these boreal and alpine components, we have these tropical components, and so forth. Another more boreal component, Parnassia Grandifolia, beautiful, beautiful flowers with a very oddly scattered distribution in the southeastern United States. Helianthus schweinesii, exemplary of Piedmont prairie, open grassland, and savanna habitats in the southeast that were fire maintained, restricted to fairly narrow distribution in North and South Carolina. And relative of a common horticultural plant, Baptisia aberrans, the errant southern Baptist, related to Baptisia australis, also with a rare scattered distribution in fire-maintained habitats, only recently recognized at species rank. The southeastern U.S. has the highest diversity of the large and diverse genus Symphyiotricum, including this one distributed from Virginia to Maryland, Virginia to South Carolina, and this Solidago, also the greatest diversity in the genus Solidago, occurs in the southeastern United States, Solidago pinetorum Small's goldenrod. A federally listed endangered species, Echinacea levigata, occurring in fire-maintained habitats of the southeast. And not to give the coastal plain short shrift, the brand new, newly named Trichostum anesophyllum baldhead blue curls, occurring only on the major capes in North and South Carolina, a little shrubby mint with pinkish flowers. And Amaranthus Pumulus, sea beach amaranth, the plant that probably grows the closest to the breakers and imperiled by sea level rise in its natural habitats. Another newly named species, Marshallia legrandii, the oak barrens Marshallia, occurs only 2 places in the world, and really a beautiful plant occurring only 1 site in Virginia and 1 site in North Carolina. The Piedmont fame flower, likewise, with only 2 locations in the world newly named. Symphyiotricum rhiannon, the Buck Creek aster, only occurs 1 place in the world, named about 2 decades ago. And occurs only on a serpentine barren in western North Carolina. And just last week, we had a new species named in the southeast, the Smoky Mountain Rhododendron, Rhododendron smokyanum, here forming these weather caused mats on Mount LeConte and adjacent parts of the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. The Trillium pusillum is in the process of being split up into about 10 species of what was formerly considered 1 or 3 or 4, but modern techniques show us that we have more species in this complex than we have previously appreciated. So one of the themes is that we continue to learn more and more about the flora of our region. We name new species. Many of them are narrowly endemic species, and this may seem depressing that we find all these new rare species, but we know about them now and we can work to conserve them. So the number of native plant species in the various states of the Southeast and the number of new species being named per decade only increasing. So you might think that we're only naming new species in the jungles of Papua New Guinea and Brazil, but we're naming a lot of new species right here in Eastern North America in our virtual backyards. So I want to shift gears and talk about how we keep that biodiversity. And I want to talk about some themes of learning about the biodiversity, studying it, loving that biodiversity, teaching about the biodiversity, and then working to conserve and restore the diversity of plant species in our region. So studying the biodiversity is kind of what I've been talking about, describing new species, being more accurate with our taxonomy, recognizing the diversity that's out there. But we also have to teach a younger generation about that biodiversity. And I'm really optimistic about where we are on this. We're still teaching in the universities, we're teaching in lots of informal settings, and we have other tools that I'll talk about in a few minutes that enable us to reach a broader than ever public. So I want to talk a little bit about this concept of plant blindness, the idea that we often don't seem to know very much about the plants that surround us, that provide us our food and our oxygen and so forth. It's just kind of a green wall. This is a picture of me when I was 5, and some of you may recognize the flower that I'm playing like a trumpet, which is the notoriously poisonous and hallucinogenic Datura stramonium, angel's trumpet, or Jimson weed. And probably my parents shouldn't have been letting me play that like a trumpet at age 5, but they did. But if we learn more about plants, there are a few of us who fall into the category of maybe we have human blindness and we know more about plants than we do about people, or we recognize and remember plant names better than we do people names. But for most of us, it goes the other way. And so I think an important thing that we do at the North Carolina Botanical Garden and the UNC Herbarium is to provide tools for people to recognize and learn about the real world, the world of native plants around them. And those are floras and apps and guides. And frankly, my philosophy is to provide tools to people at all levels of sophistication and in all formats, from big fat tomes with lots of technical terminology to apps to wildflower guides, and basically put it out there for people to learn about. So the Flora of Virginia, we wrote almost 10 years ago and published the first Flora of Virginia in 250 years. We're currently working on the Flora of the Southeastern United States, over 10,000 species, published in apps and individual apps by state and apps by physiographic province, PDFs, excuse me. But a lot of people, what really want is an app. It's something like Spock's tricorder that they can point at a plant and it'll tell them the name. And we're not quite there yet, but we are working on more and more sophisticated apps that use machine learning and easy graphic keys to enable people to identify plants. iNaturalist has introduced a machine learning component into their online and social media that really helps serve citizen science and helps engage a lot of people in learning about the flora around them and reporting occurrences of rare species and invasive species and so forth. But for a lot of people, they want something simpler still and not as complete and more visual. And so we also develop wildflower guides to meet that need. I know that I grew up with Peterson Wildflower Guides, and it instilled in me a lifelong love of natural history and the diversity around me. So I want to close with the idea that we need to cure plant blindness and build botanical capacity. If we do those things, our biodiversity, our world around us, has a great future. So we face some challenges, but I'm more optimistic than I've ever been about our ability to find, conserve, restore biological diversity around us, our native flora, and ecosystems and plants that are dependent on those as well. And I love this quote from Baba Dioum, a Senegalese forester. In the end, we will conserve only what we love. We will love only what we understand, and we will understand only what we are taught. Thank you.
All right, another fantastic talk in our lineup. Next, we are going to have Laura Call-Gastinger, and she is the lead illustrator of Flora of Virginia.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. I'm so glad that I'm following Alan weekly, because my talk will definitely connect to that curating and fostering that love of plants and that awareness of plants. And what I wanted to talk to you about as a botanical artist and illustrator is how I've created this technique called the Perpetual Journal that I want to inspire you to think about, that will help you discover the native plants around you through drawing. Even if you're not an artist, that's okay. So I'm excited to tell you about it. I'm going to start a little bit about myself, and I really love this quote by E.O. Wilson. Here I am growing up as a young girl. I grew up in Virginia Beach. The naturalist's journey has only begun, and for all intents and purposes will go on forever. It is possible to spend a lifetime in a Magellanic voyage around the trunk of a tree. And I think many of the speakers have already spoken about how your backyard can become this repository of inspiration and learning and just a lot of curiosity and discovery. I started as a plant ecologist. I went to Virginia Tech, and I actually studied the competitive interactions between our native black locust and then our invasive Ailanthus altissima. But then I heard about the Flora of Virginia project, and they needed an illustrator. So for 10 years, I was that lucky chief illustrator. We had other illustrators too that did ferns and the graminoids too. And I would draw at home. It was an amazing job. And then I would ink, and then the end I ended up inking about 1,300 drawings. I also do paintings, and I specifically love native plants. And so I love, one of my favorite places is Big Meadows up in Shenandoah National Park. So here's a few little watercolor paintings of those. As a botanical artist, I travel to London to exhibit in botanical art shows and share my love of Virginia flora. In 2007, I got a gold medal featuring a different, they were called 10 Walks in Virginia. And these are also watercolors through the different seasons of Virginia flora. You can see my residual like plant ecology background coming through in my art. And then most recently in 2018, I went back for a second gold medal. I did another one, Seeing Plants a Year in Virginia. And I created these paintings every month in Virginia of different plants. There's more on my website, but here's some of my favorites. This is February. I compose them in very graphically beautiful ways. So April, this is the month we're in. So, you know, with the Pinkster Bloom Azalea and Dicentra and Ecologia and Trout Lily and Dogwood and all the ferns. May with Maidenhair Fern and Tulip Poplar. August, the month of August. And then January has some nuts. So that's just a few of them. But what I'm really here to talk about is really how you don't have to do that type of botanical art, but you can, in your own home, you can start journaling and drawing the plants that you see. And I love this quote by the poet Linda Hogan. There is a way that nature speaks, that land speaks. Most of the time, we're simply not patient enough, quiet enough to pay attention to the story. And so through drawing, it's one way to slow down and pay attention, learn your plants, and really be in tune with the seasonality and the dynamics of plants and pollinators. Okay, so some of you maybe have journals, and you start your journal and then it's hard to finish it, right? Like I have journals like that. The first few pages are started, or you can't keep it up. Well, the Perpetual Journal is your solution, okay? So how does it work? So I coined this phrase with my husband. And so it's really great once you set it up, okay? So you can start any date. I start at the beginning of the year, the calendar year, but you could start, first day of spring, your birthday, whatever works for you. But you have to divide up those pages. So like I said, I start January 1st, January 1st through 7th, and I divide it into weeks, January 8th through 14th, January 15th through 21st, on and on. So you just set up those pages first. Then it repeats that each year, and you just go back to that page and write something down. Let's say you're not an artist, but you just write something down. So here on the week of January 15th through 21st, in 2001, I wrote a little note here, and then I drew some little berries, some dogwood berries. And then I came back in 02 and wrote something here. And then I skipped a ton of years, I think, because of the kids and the flora, and I came back in 2017 of this week and drew something. It becomes a really rich, multi-layered project. So these are the dates that I use. You can do whatever, you can date it however you like, but this works really well. So here's an example of a page and how it works really well. So here's the week of August 20th through 26th. Here's 2016, 2012, 2016 here again, and 2012. So each year, I just add, like, if I can, or think about it, add something. So then you know, oh, when am I going to see impatiens? When am I going to see New York ironweed? And it's already there, and like you kind of have it. You get to learn your plants. You really get to be in tune with what's around you. Okay. So I've already mentioned a few reasons, but why do this, right? So, well, I said observe the seasonal changes and learn native plants. I have had so many students say that they never thought winter was exciting, or fall, or mainly winter, but they see so many things, and they learn the seed pods in the winter, and then they see what it turns into in the spring and summer. And so you get to see the whole season, and you become so in tune with it. And you get to learn your native plants. So many of my students don't, a lot of us here probably know our native plants, but if you're new to that, this is a great way to start. You find something, you draw it, you look it up, you learn about it, and then you can expand on that. I've had students that have just learned that after 15 years, like the tree in their front yard is an oak tree through this process of drawing their plant through the season. It's a mindful practice. We all need screen-free time, don't we? And even if it's just like 10 minutes, this is quality meditation, mindful practice. It will improve your drawing skills. I know that so many people say they can't draw, and that's okay. We all start somewhere. And year after year of adding little drawings into this, maybe the first year your Columbine doesn't look that good. That's a hard one to draw. But maybe, 3 years later might be pretty good, and you'll be able to see like comparisons. It will make you more curious and observant. I have so many students that say they go outside, they see things they've never seen before. They're more in tune with what's around them. And it's a forgiving format. You don't have to draw every day. You can skip a week if you want, but the pages are dated, so you just come right back and just add a little thing. And for botanical artists, you really need to practice both. You need to have the loose sketching in the journal, and then the tight detailed work on the paper, the parchment. Or you need to have the imperfect drawing and then perfect paintings. So for botanical artists, you kind of need to have both if that's something you're striving for. So this is how I set it up. If you're on Instagram, you should follow me. And if you use this hashtag, people all around the world are creating these perpetual journals. So it's hashtag LG Perpetual Journal. I have a custom-made journal, and Lindsay Mears, this woman hand makes them. She's on Etsy, so I encourage you to support her. It's a little pricey, but you know what? This is a book that you will have as a family treasure for years. It might take you 5 to 10 years to fill it up. So I use a micron pen. That's what I also use for the Flora of Virginia. I use a water brush so I don't have to carry paints that knock over. And then there's so many beautiful portable paint sets out there. So lots of options. You can make it very involved, lots of supplies, or not so much. And so what do you put in there? So date, where you are, the weather, who's with you, senses, really just sort of capture that. Pollinators, how things feel. Of course, I love plants, so I do things like you can number of petals, color, the arrangement of leaves, leaf type, stem description. These are all great things to really pay attention to, especially if you're trying to learn basic ID. You need to know these things when you go to, you need to know how leaves are arranged and stuff like that. So a lot of times people are so anxious about these blank white pages. So there's things you can do. You can draw plants from branches from the sides of the pages, flowers up from the bottom, just to get started. Use the edges of your pages to help you, right? Let's say you don't really like drawing. You're like, Laura, I can't do a botanical illustration like you. Well, start tiny. Start like with the little twig. Start with the little, the cone or the scale or the little, the leaf. You know, you don't have to draw the whole thing. Write lots of text, write lots of description. This isn't about creating a botanical illustration. This is about being curious and writing the observations that you see around you. These are all common questions I get. I don't have enough time. It doesn't have to be long. It could be 10 minutes or 30 minutes. I can't collect, I'm not allowed to, or the weather's bad. Totally fine. You can take pictures and draw and finish at home. I do that a lot, actually. I'm a beginner, I can't draw. Again, just draw little things, draw small things. And then next year, maybe you'll want to draw a bigger part, you know, you'll get better. And it will be very rewarding. Not only will your knowledge base of plants and what's around you grow, your skills will too. And then I made a mistake. I can't erase with pen. If you notice, I only use pen. Happens to me too. But see if you can find any mistakes. I'll show you some pages. I have, like I said, I have 2 journals. They're both handmade. The top one, I started in 2001 and kept it going till 2017. And it sort of got filled enough. Some seasons fill up more, you know. Spring is just really overloaded. And then I started a second one that overlapped a little bit from 2016 to current. So here are a few of those pages. So here is, and these are pretty done, you know, so I started this in 2016. So this is January, so you can see things like the heart leaf and pine cones and skunk cabbage, which was so exciting to see in the snow, and witch's butter, and all these things that were new to me sometimes, like witch's butter, I didn't know that. Even, you know, the decaying leaves are just so beautiful to document, and the beech drops. And then here's also in January. Actually, this was crazy because what you can start to see is that this was the earliest that maple buds were ever blooming since I've been recording since 2001. So in some ways, you can actually start to see these climate changes in your backyard. So you can see I do a lot of different pen work with stippling or hatching and things like that. Then we get into March where it starts to get very, lots of things are blooming, like the bloodroot. Now you notice I'm not only doing native plants, but you know what, a lot of these things, for me, it's native and naturalized. And also I restrict my journal to the Piedmont and Blue Ridge of Virginia. If I travel, I take a different journal. It's something different. So this is trying to winnow it down. So I know just Piedmont and Blue Ridge of Virginia. And yeah, so I have some invasive things in here. But then I lift up and I'm aware of the native ones too. Here we are into March and seeing all the mayapple and the black cohosh coming out of the emerging, and the ferns and the hepatica. You know, it's such a beautiful, beautiful time. Okay, and then, gosh, can't wait for this week, May with the lady slippers, and let's see, we also have blackberry and more chrysogonum and blue cohosh. Love blue cohosh. And then sometimes I do a lot with ferns. This is actually not, this is up in Vermont. So this was before I sort of restricted myself. So sometimes I do mushrooms. And even if you don't know what a plant or specimen is, I still encourage you to just draw it, right? So I didn't know all these mushrooms, but there's something in the whole exploration and getting it on paper and really being mindful with the nature that's around you that's so powerful. And let's see, the the sumac and let's see what else is in there. Jump seed. Some pages I do lots of very fine detail, and then sometimes it's just like quick sketches, you know? So it doesn't have to be so perfect. It can be very quick. And then the curling leaves in the fall with the acorns. And then dried things with snow on them. So in conclusion, though, if you're interested in this, I do offer classes in it over a series of 3 months. I do teach pen techniques and sepia watercolor. But I connect with a lot of people on Instagram, email, or you can subscribe to me, and that's very supportive. But my quote actually is almost like Alan's quote by Rachel Carson. The more clearly we can focus our attention on the wonders and realities of the universe about us, the less taste we shall have for its destruction. And I think that Perpetual Journal will really embodies that and it captures that. So just email me if you have any questions or put some questions in the question and answer, and I'll answer them. Thank you guys so much.
Awesome. Okay, here we keep going. Thank you, Laura. All right, next we have John Mcgee, president of Mcgee Design, director of the Cullowhee Native Plant Conference, and creator, host of the Native Plant Podcast.
We've just come out of winter as I'm working on this. Winter to me is the season of so many wonderful things that are often overlooked by the common person. Things like seeing the bark of the sycamore trees that line our waterways, or to watch the scrub pines gently swaying in the winter winds. But probably my favorite things are the fields of broom sedge that dot our landscape. It's not really until the end of winter when they truly shine, and I do mean shine. Beside their beauty to the human eye, they serve as an essential purpose in the native winter landscape. There are literally thousands of insects and songbirds that rely on these fields of gold to provide them with shelter and sustenance through the worst of the winter days. Winter's over now and given way to spring. It's actually morel season right now, and I've found my first few of the season already. Phenology in the landscape is a wonderful thing. Not only can it tell us when certain birds will be returning, it can help me in my journey to find my favorite mushroom, the morel. They are delicious, but I look at the native plants of the area to tell me when to look for them. Bluebells are one of everyone's favorite springtime ephemerals. You know, wildflowers that come up for a short time, flower, and then quickly fade. It's when the bluebells are at their peak bloom that I start my hunt. I know that by the time the bluebells have faded, so has morel season. Many of my foraging friends use the redbud trees as indicators, but I guess I just have more bluebells nearby, and they pretty much occupy the same moment in our springtime phenology. If you know me, you've probably heard me say something like, nothing says Virginia like ... Well, nothing says Virginia like Virginia bluebells. Mertensia virginica. Maybe it was the broom sedge, maybe it was the stone walls, but right now, at this moment in our phenology, nothing says Virginia like Virginia bluebells. It's also about this time that wood frog tadpoles can be seen in vernal pools around here. It's amazing to me that this frog is out so early to take advantage of the temporary pools and lack of competition that form from the spring rains. The only amphibian to live so far north where it can actually freeze in the wintertime, and yet, come springtime, will return to the vernal pools to repopulate. I wonder if it looks to the bluebells too. Simply adding a vernal pool to your landscape could be life-changing for the amphibians of your area. Speaking of blue, it's around this time the indigo buntings return and breed. But why am I mentioning all these things in a talk about native plants? Well, quite simply, native plants support all these kinds of life. Right now I'm waiting for my coral honeysuckle to flower so my hummingbirds will have food when they return. Phenology. It's how all of nature is interwoven, and proof that when you start planting native plants in your yard, you'll start to see these little gifts from nature start to show up where you live. If you plant enough native plants and attract enough life to your garden, you'll even be blessed by seeing some of the cooler animals in the world. Like this barred owl, who has actually lived with us for a very long time, but only recently been showing himself more often as he gets used to seeing us working out in the garden. I love their call. Who cooks? Who cooks for you? They'll cry that out, telling their neighbors that this is their territory. Who cooks? Who cooks for you? As they're looking for a mate, or maybe just looking for someone to take hunting. Whatever the case may be, I'm blessed to see him on an almost daily basis, and I wouldn't if it weren't for the native plants growing in my yard. Myself, I enjoy lowering my blood pressure by watching the caterpillars eating in my yard. Nothing's more relaxing to me than that little chomp, chomp, chomp of a caterpillar munching its way through my gardens. Of course, if you have caterpillars, then you're going to have moths and butterflies, those flying flowers I always mention that come free with the native plants you just planted. Insects greatly benefit from planting native plants. And if native plants are the backbone and skeleton of the landscape, insects are its lifeblood. Of course, insects need all the help we can give them, as we've spent far too long trying to get rid of most of them. But some of the most beautiful things in this world are insects. When I'm asked to design a landscape for someone, one of the very first things people ask is, will this bring more butterflies to my yard? We've long landscaped with plants for their ornamental qualities, while completely skipping over their more important ecological services. Now don't get me wrong, everyone is still looking to have a beautiful landscape, but you can have that tenfold by emphasizing native plants. When you commit to planting more native plants in your landscape, you're committing to the idea of improving the ecology of your area, along with making it more beautiful. Diverse plantings and layers help to support many types of life, not just insects or birds, but mammals and reptiles as well. I know it may seem a little funny to brag about the lizards in my rock walls, but they live there and help to maintain the equilibrium in my yard. I don't use or need pesticides. I don't use or need herbicides. And living along a waterway, it's good to stay away from those things to begin with. Stormwater management has become a key element of modern landscape design. For many years, we've designed landscapes to shed rainwater as quickly as possible. But now, we're designing ways to keep it, to hold it a little while, to cleanse it while it's there, and then slowly release it back into the landscape. Our rivers and streams are becoming healthier because of these key element changes. And again, it's all about sustaining life. Imagine, if you can, what it would be like being fascinated by seeing a dragonfly breathing. Rain gardens, for lack of a better description, are basically a mud puddle. I guess they could be large or small, but most of them that homeowners put in are what I would call big mud puddles. But a relatively small landscape feature. It's not like you're putting in a patio or a deck after all. You're creating a mud puddle. Every kid's dream. The goal of a rain garden is to create a depression where stormwater can gather and set for a moment, while some plants you put there drink up what liquid they can in the time that they have it. Funny thing though, rain gardens dry out sometimes, and those plants that like to have their feet wet, well, they need to tolerate those conditions too. And they can. There's a native plant literally for every situation. The carpenter bee, one of the weightlifters of the bee world. One of the only bees strong enough to pull apart the petals of closed gentian. That's right, closed, not open. What a great way of ensuring you'll be pollinated. By making the pollinator fight their way inside of your flower and completely immerse themselves in your nectar and pollen. Genius! Absolutely genius. Thank you, little pollinators, for all the work you do. I really like food, and I hope you'll help us have some good things to eat for the foreseeable future.
All right, bee butts, so cute. That was lovely. All right, our next talk is Alonzo Bugattis Jr., the Natural Resources Manager in the Department of Parks and Recreation, author of the popular blog and Facebook page, Capital Naturalist.
Well, thank you all very much, and I appreciate it being here. I do want to talk about landscaping, not just for pollinators, not just for wildlife, but keeping people in mind. People have heard me talk in the past, always likes to, I like to refer to, I guess, the nature's puzzle. And so that's what I ended up, that's sort of what I end up talking about the most, is how everything is interconnected in life. And we'll kind of look at that, and that includes people. But first of all, some shameless self-promotion. If you guys aren't following me on any of my social media platforms, I certainly encourage you guys to do so. So please do, and it's a wonderful sharing of information and so forth, and we depend on people like you to actually get some of the stuff onto my different channels. So again, something about why would you plant native plants? And again, you've heard a lot of different reasons, but just to go over them just one more time, one of which is they, of course, provide more food and shelter with the animals. Why? Because they evolved with them. And they're also preferred by these different kinds of wildlife. Why? Again, because they evolved with them. They're also adapted to, to our environmental and soil conditions. I mean, those of you guys who are master gardeners know the mantra, right plant, right place. And as we mentioned before, there is basically a plant for just about every niche, every location out there where it's suitable. And there's a ton to choose from. If you look just up here in Northern Virginia, there's about 1,700 native species. So there's a ton of them. You also have to understand that plants have multiple uses. So it's not just aesthetics. It can be wildlife value, ecological value. It can be also be edible value. Edible landscaping is catching on. So a lot of different reasons, but a lot of the native plants can supply some of these uses. So the other thing I wanted to mention is, again, going right back to insects, something that people have mentioned quite a bit. And since insects can lay so many eggs, as long as they have the right plant for them to do so, you can make a huge difference locally. Again, about 50% of insects eat plants, and of these, 90% of these are specialists. They only feed on one or two different groups of plants. But that's important because they feed, again, 96% of the land birds, and that's something we mentioned before. But something people also forget is that these plants then support all of the insectivorous insects that we have in the Mid-Atlantic. All 18 of them need the insects to feed on. And so if, a lot of people, what can I do for the bats and stuff like that, build bat root boxes, that doesn't really work, but planting native plants does. And of course, they're also very attractive. Something that's not already mentioned, it kind of goes into this idea of the idea of host plants, as well as the idea of nature's puzzle, is about 1/5 of our native bees. We have about 450 or so in Maryland and Virginia. They depend on a limited number of plants that provide just the right pollens. Without these pollens, they cannot reproduce. It's much like the idea of, monarchs and planting milkweed. Same thing with them. If you don't have the right plant, and again, that's the plant that they evolve with, they won't be able to reproduce. Again, these are illegal bees, and on the right-hand side, you can see a lot of the different plants that they depend on, some of which are very common that you have in your own yards. Things like ironweeds, things like sunflowers, dogwoods. Right now in bloom are Claytonians, which not only of all the ephemeral plants has had more pollinator visits and anything else, but it has a particular bee specialist that needs it or cannot reproduce. So again, just the idea that you're planting these things for all different kinds of insects, that includes pollinators, because again, if you want to support 1/5 for native bees, you got to plant the right plant to be evolved with. And we go right back to this idea that that Tallamy has mentioned before about keystone plants, and of course the best keystone plants are oaks. And it's not just because they support 557 different caterpillar species here in the Mid-Atlantic, but look at all the different kinds of other things they do. 40 different kinds of mammals feed on them, 60 different kinds of birds, 61 wood-boring insects, 21 leafhoppers, 550 gall wasps that feed on there, tree hoppers, again, and that's just, things that they feed on. There is tons of things such as nesting material, shelter, and so forth that you get from an oak. So again, a keystone plant in so many different ways. But you can also plant stuff that are much smaller. In this case, wild strawberries, little white flowers that are soon, which actually are in bloom in my yard already. And again, not too picky. You can see here they're growing out of, basically the edges of my driveway. But when you plant these things, you're not only supplying a host plant for 81 different kinds of caterpillars, but 53 different kinds of birds feed on it. There's at least one bee specialist that needs it. And again, tons of mammals, including us, like to eat it as well. So there's lots of different reasons for planting different plants. And some of them we can be selfish. It's not just aesthetics. It's not just because we want to help wildlife. But again, some of the stuff can be selfish because we can plant some edible landscaping. This is one of them. And again, you want to look for the white flowers, not the yellow ones, which unfortunately the barren ground strawberry is an invasive that's all over the place. But they're wonderful edible types of fruit. And just one of many other kinds of edible types of fruit, such as service berries. When you plant a service berries, yes, it's 124 caterpillars to feed on it, but there's over 42 birds to feed on it, and more than 24 different kinds of mammals. And again, it's pretty to look at. So just one other example of a lot of different things that you can do to be, to help out wildlife, be a good neighbor, as it will, but also the wonderful thing that you're helping yourself out, whether it's by food, just whether it's by beauty, whatever the case may be. So again, most people, when they plant milkweeds, they're thinking, oh yeah, we want the monarch. But there's 12 different kinds of Lepidoptera, butterflies, and moths that feed on it, okay? And so when you're planting milkweed, you're also helping out a lot of these other things. These are just some examples of some of these other animals that feed on milkweed. Most of them are very much specialist. A few of them can feed on other things such as dogvane, but they gather up the toxin from it, and they themselves have these beautiful colors because a pessimistic warning. They're telling everybody, don't eat me, I taste bad. So you're planting for one thing, but you're helping out so many others. Another one of the keystone plants, and this time something smaller, very easy to include in many of our yards, are goldenrods. They bloom in the fall. And again, lots of birds feed on the seeds and so forth. Different kinds of mammals forage on them. Tons of different kinds of other insects, including grasshoppers. 13 different grasshoppers feed on this. And again, we were talking about bees and helping pollinators. Well, if you want to help out some kinds of pollinators, at least 11 of them need goldenrod, the pollen from them, in order to reproduce. And so that's just one other example. And again, it is a host plant for 115 different caterpillar species, but a lot of other things that you can see here. So wonderful to include. There's one for just about every type of habitat that's out there. Same thing can be said of the asters, which have divided them up into a variety of different other families. I should say different genuses. But again, tons of animals feed on them. 109 different caterpillars feed on them. A ton of bees, including 8 of them, which have to have asters or they just cannot reproduce. You include different kinds of aphids, 7 bugs, flies, beetles, a lot of different things. And again, I do put down that Virginia has 38 different species. Again, there is an aster that will grow for just about every growing condition, whether it's shade, whether it's the sun, whether it's wet, dry, whatever the case may be. So you can always supply something. And again, these are things that perhaps people, when they buy an aster, or in the case of a goldenrod, to me, I bought them for aesthetic reason. But the nice thing is you're also helping out wildlife. So again, we can continue to look at these things. And one of the things to kind of mention are the different kinds of mints and so forth. These, again, they might only support 7 different kinds of caterpillars, but it's called bee balm, or some of them are, for a good reason. That is, it attracts a ton of different kinds of bees, including one specialist bee that has to have it or cannot survive. Some people know that when you plant it, you attract a lot of predatory wasps, and that helps with that. And on top of everything else, because the mints do spread like mints. They grow very, very quickly. It's an easy plant to, if you have the right place for it, to put it out there, and it's deer resistant. So another reason to plant this kind of thing, and wonderful to look at, wonderful for aesthetic reasons as well. And something that perhaps people don't realize is something as easy as the elderberries. Elderberries are fantastic. 100 different kinds of birds feed on the berries and so forth. But it's not just that, but 42 different kinds of caterpillars feed on them. And there's at least 14 different mammals that like to eat the fruits themselves. And I mean, heck, who doesn't like to eat, in the right conditions, likes to eat elderberries? It's been found medicinal for a lot of different reasons as well. So a lot of different reasons include this. And if nothing else, those hollow stems are wonderful, because what do? They actually do supply nesting homes for about 30% of our bees nest in above the ground in places like holes and places like that. And this supplies wonderful different versions of places for certain kinds of bees to nest in. So if we continue looking, again, you may have something that's a little bit, you may think, oh, well, what can I plant in certain conditions? There's a plant for just about everything. If you have a small little pond, this is from my own pond at my house. Look, I mean, it's very easy, a Penthus pickleweed. And not only are there 4 different caterpillars that feed on it, that use it as a host plant, but you've got 2 different kinds of specialty bees that have to have this pollen. And again, when it's in bloom, it attracts a ton of different things. So wonderful to include, wonderful to have in there. You can find a good native plant to fit just about every situation that you have in your house or whatever the case may be. So wonderful, just stick to native plants and you're being a good neighbor to everything else that's out there as well. Now, I know this may have been mentioned before. It may seem kind of obvious, but again, you should be members of your local native plant society or your local chapter. Or if not, at least friend them on Facebook or something like that. Follow along on them. Check out their websites. You can find out when the native plant sales are. You can find out, when there's different events. Many of their presentations to do are open to the public. So even if you're not a member, you can still learn a whole bunch of different kinds of things about native plants and so forth. So first thing you should do is find out what your nearest Native Plant Society chapter is near you, and you should become a part of it and follow along on whatever social media you want to, and they can keep you informed of all the neat things that are out there. And again, all of it open up to the public in most cases. Again, those of us may also want to do something more special. I mean, people who help monarchs, they want to plant monarch way stations. And again, when you're doing that, as I mentioned, you're not just helping the monarch, but you're helping everything else as well. But you can do that, or get your habitat certified, either by National Wildlife Federation or Audubon at Home. They both do it in different ways. They both classify in different ways, but regardless, by classifying it, you can put that out there, and then other people know you care for your wild neighbors. You care for, for these different kinds of things and trying to provide habitat. And so it's a good thing to advertise. So if you can, go ahead and certify your yard. And again, follow along on all these different kinds of things. I mean, a Capital Naturalist, obviously, I hope you guys will follow along on there, but there's a great native plant podcast when you're driving and so forth. I love to listen to it, and get involved with the local native plant campaigns. The Plant Nova Natives campaign, for example, here for you guys that are local, is wonderful. And with it, their latest campaign has to do with planting trees and so forth. But you can find out a lot of different kinds of things. They've gone out to many of the local nurseries, and those that allow them to, they put down which things are native and so forth, so that it's easier for people to decide that. Whenever possible, go out there and to different nurseries, whatever it is, and demand native plants. A lot of times when they see this demand out there, they're much more likely to then have that for you in the future. So folks, again, lots of different things that you can do to help out. Join your local campaign, whatever the case may be. But again, lots of different ways you can do this. And lots of good publications out there. On the left is one that's been around for quite a while, here in the Chesapeake Bay. Wonderful plants for certain situations. Talks about the different places that you can plant these different kinds of plants. But even more specific, as I mentioned, there's native plant campaigns. As I mentioned, Plant Nova Natives were here, but there's different ones for all parts of the state. And so you can find the local one and find out what exactly is the locally adapted species. What is the one that is in bloom that should be planted there? Because it's probably something that's adapted to a lot of conditions that are out there, although this does help with some different ideas in there as well. But more so than anything else, you are planting stuff that then helps many other different kinds of things. Maybe you plant it because it's beautiful to look at, but again, it could be hosting all sorts of different kinds of caterpillars, or it could be one of the many keystone plants that you're planting there, or it's something that 1/5 of our bees, native bees, need in order to survive. Whatever the case may be, you're then supplying food to 96% of land birds, and again, for all 18 of our different bats that are out there. So be a good neighbor, think native, and again, you can be part of this puzzle as well by providing it. You can provide just the right kind of habitat and so forth. The idea of this national park, that's fantastic. And where does it start? With our own individual yards. So folks, do what you can. I often, when I teach different kinds of classes, especially master gardeners, I say, look, especially here in Arlington, where it's only 4.4% natural lands, we can't depend on those tiny little bits of natural lands to support everything. But we are surrounded by tons of neighbors, and many of them have already taken on the call of planting locally native plants. So you can do it as well. And then you can add to this national park. You can add to it, because by ourselves, our own different counties, jurisdictions can't do it. But with you, we all can. So folks, the word's out there, landscape with native plants. You're helping yourself out, helping the pollinators. And again, there's all sorts of different reasons why you want to plant natives. So thank you very much. And again, I invite you to follow me along on Capital Naturals. Thank you.
Fantastic. That was wonderful. Thank you all panelists for participating. We now have about 15 minutes for questions. We've been keeping track of some of these questions that have been sent in via chat. And I think to first start, I noticed that one was tagged. Was that, Laura, did you tag a question or did you already answer that one?
If somebody asked from my website, I accidentally clicked live.
Okay, got it. Great. I have one here for Doug Tallamy. And I think this is a great question to answer. How exactly do white lights kill insects? I would want to be able to explain this to my neighbors.
Okay, there's about 6 different ways. They can kill them through exhaustion. That moth flies around and around and around and around until it just simply drops. Through incineration, they get so close they simply burn up. Or collisions, they fly straight into the bulb and smash themselves. The bat comes and picks them off while they're flying around, or a lot of them will rest on the side of the building the light is on, and then the birds come in the morning. They learn very quickly. That's a good place to get dinner, breakfast. Night lights blind a lot of nocturnal insects, so that then they're blinded. Who knew that? And it keeps them from doing the things they're supposed to be doing. They're supposed to be flying around and finding mates and finding host plants. So all of those things are very negative.
Okay. Let's see, I've got one that I think that as a group we might be able to answer, and I'll start. Building this transition backyard, I think they're talking about HOA maybe, I'm not sure. Using cardboard and mulch to perennial natives, looking for tips on how to lessen maintenance of pulling grass without chemicals. The HOA sends mowing crews to some woodies in raised beds. So the way that I usually recommend this via the nursery is there's a really great way to kill grass and also plant directly into it as you're starting to establish a native perennial bed. And that is called sheet mulching. There are multiple ways to do sheet mulching. Some nurseries will recommend, the landscaping fabric either made out of fabric itself or plastic. I would not listen to that advice. There is a better method. It's either through the use of layering newspaper down or layering cardboard down. If you want to put it directly over lawns, make sure there's no plastic on the cardboard, pull off all the tape, don't use glossy boxes, layer that up with a couple to 3 inches of mulch, and then you can plant directly in it. You do want to make sure that the cardboard is fully saturated all the way through, either by watering it yourself with the hand hose or waiting for a really heavy rain. And that is the most effective method that I have found that also contributes to increase in nutrient within the soil itself. So you're not adding to the problem by degrading the soil or taking out the lawn. So it's easy, low maintenance, and contributes to nutrients. Does any of the other panelists have something to add on that?
That's a good summary.
Okay. Great. Are there any other keystone plants in addition to oaks? So I know, Doug, you bring up oaks a lot. Is there a list of keystone native plants that you could direct us to?
There is, and I should have mentioned that. You can go to the National Wildlife Federation website and look for Native Plant Finder and put in your zip code, and the top ranked plants, both woody and herbaceous plants for your county will pop up. So no matter where you live, you can get a list of they're ranked from the top to the bottom. And so, you know, there's not, it's a continuum, and the top ones, of course, are going to be more keystone than the ones in the middle. But willows are ranked very high. Native prunus are ranked very high. Birches are ranked very high. Oaks are the best, but the others are ranked high as well. And then that changes a little bit as you move around the country.
Okay. Question potentially for Betsy and the rest of us. How does the shift in USDA growing zones figure in the homegrown park concept? So we do have climate change happening. Which natives are suitable as the planet warms, extreme weather, deluge rain, droughts, fires, and polar vortex, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah, that's a great question. And all of those same climate models are used for the native plants as they are for the growing USDA growing areas. And so, you know, the best way for you to understand and know what your, you know, the appropriate plants are for your growing area, which has been mentioned by other speakers, is to simply look for those plants either through that National Wildlife Foundation website that was just listed, or to simply look up these native plants specific to your region, these native plant guides. These are all native plants that are native to the area, and these plants are shifting across the landscape. And so this is an area of active research, but many of them have these really wide ranges. And so the ones that are listed in those native plant guides are typically those that you have these wide ranges that you can plant in your yard if it is listed for that particular area that you live in.
I would caution for those of you who think, well, I can take a southern plant and plant it up north because everything's going to get warmer. If you look around and look what's happened the last several years, yes, the globe is getting warmer on average slowly. But what's really happening is the weather's getting much more erratic. So we have hot spells, but we also have very cold spells. We have the polar vortex coming down. And if you start moving southern plants up, those cold spells are still happening. And it's gonna nail them. So I am thinking that the plants that are in your appropriate zone now have the best chance of adapting if they've got a lot of genetic variability in them. As opposed to you saying, well, I'm going to get a southern plant and move it north. I wouldn't do that.
Yeah, and I'll speak as a nursery owner and propagator that what Doug is talking about with genetic diversity, it's good to pay attention to where you get your plants. Plants that are grown from seed, plants that are grown from seed that is legally collected locally is probably your best bet. That is not always available, but just as a way to direct you towards how do I increase diversity even within a singular species, that's how you would find that. I have another question here that I've tried to answer, but I'm wondering if I could crowdsource it via the panel. Is there a good app that can identify if something you are looking at is native or invasive, as opposed to just identifying what plant or animal is likely to be, like iNaturalist does? So now I shared a couple of national and regional resources. These are resources where you can record or report the presence of an invasive, not necessarily resources that'll give you an ID. And this is IMAP invasives. And also you can Google in your region for Partnerships for Regional Invasive Species Management, or PRISM. Does the rest of the panel have something to add as far as finding an ID for an invasive?
Again, I think that if once you identify it, even if you use iNaturalist or whatever the case may be, then you can always look it back up on your digital atlas, for example, of the Flora of Virginia, and then you can tell whether or not it's native and to what county it's even native to, if historically found in one place to another. It will list invasives as well as natives, but it'll also list what your ranges were. So once you know the plant, then it becomes much easier to identify whether it's native, introduced, or whatever the case may be.
Or simply get at that iPhone, take a picture of it, the flowers, the leaf or something, put it on iNaturalist, you will get an ID right away. And you know, then somebody who really knows will tell you, you don't have to guess.
Right, cool, thank you. Let's see, I've got one here about, can you address the challenges of reestablishing fungal dependent species like oaks, for example, in depleted soils, ways to accelerate soil fungal colonization, etc.?
Yeah, the best way is to inoculate that soil So what I would do if I was planting a white oak, and I really was worried about the quality of the soil, although white oaks do pretty well in lousy soil, but I would go to an existing white oak, and not in somebody's front yard, but maybe in the woods, and scoop up some the top layer of soil, some leaf litter. It doesn't have to be very much, and simply put it around your planting, and mycorrhizae and other things that are necessary will inoculate the soil that is around your planting. That works really well. Keep in mind that the spores of these fungal associations are floating around all the time. I tried to do an experiment once in a greenhouse where I didn't want any mycorrhizae at all, and finally gave up because they kept colonizing my pots without me doing anything. So they get around easier than you think.
Yes. Another way, just as a side point, is introducing organic material. In other words, material that has carbon in it. This is the idea from the first presentation I gave of mimicking kind of what you would see out in nature. So that's a way to rebuild soil, which will begin to introduce these associations and relationships into the soil that you have in your garden.
But we've experimented with some of restoration plantings and things like that. We use leaf mulch from the area where you expect to find these plants. And again, it's much like Doug said, you put it in there, you've introduced a lot of different things, not just fungi, but whatever else should be in the soil regardless.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Let's see. There's a couple in here about gardening tips. I wonder if some of you could help as well. Planting under trees. Sometimes planting under trees, dry shade is a difficult habitat to find native plants to be able to plant there. Often it is an issue of really just soil being degraded over time. But I wonder if some of you could speak to some specific recommendations on what to do, and if it is true that the trees are actually what are taking up the soil moisture, or if it is something else.
Trees do take up soil moisture, but I think one of the best ways to restore the soil under your trees and keep the moisture in there is to get a nice bed of the leaves of that tree under there. Rather than raking up your leaves and throwing them away in the fall, keep them, put them under the tree. It's a great way to smother the grass that might be hanging on there, but it'll restore the moisture in the soil. And then you can plant right through that the following year. It's a very easy way to create a bed. And even if it's too shady to support anything, you're preparing the soil in a way that allow those caterpillars to drop down to be able to get underground and be totally happy.
Okay, I'm gonna ask, will someone please discuss the importance of provenance in natives? Who wants to take that?
I can take it if you don't. I don't want to hog it. Provenance, you're talking about the degree to which a plant is genetically adapted to the particular place you're in. And if it's not, it won't do well. And I'll just give you a quick example. There was a nursery going out of business in southern Jersey 20 years ago. And they had a bunch of plants for sale really cheap. So my wife and I drove over there and we loaded our car with plants, and there were 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 beech trees, small beech trees. Oh, great, we're going to put beech in. We planted them. The next year, they leafed out, I don't know, 3 weeks before the beeches, the native beeches in my area would have leafed out. And what happened was the seed stock, even though this nursery was in South Jersey, very close to where we were, I'm sure the seeds for those beeches came from someplace way far south. So they were outside of their provenance and they leafed out too early. Then we got a frost and all the leaves dropped off. And they're still alive, but they're dwarfed. I mean, you've got to meet the genetic adaptations of the plant you've got to match that with the area in which you are planting, because that plant is already adapted to the latitude, to the altitude, to the rainfall. And that's why provenance is important.
Okay, thank you. We've got only a couple minutes. I will add to that statement, it is important to support your native nurseries.
Yeah, that too.
You can find native plants and cultivars of native plants in some of the larger non-native plant nurseries, and also in box stores like Lowe's. There are issues with some cultivars which can be it's a whole other topic for discussion. But the best thing is really to talk to your native nurseries, support them wherever it is that you are, ask them questions. If they know what they're doing, they're going to be able to answer questions about where they source their plant material for you.
I have to go to my podcast now. Goodbye, everybody.
Bye. And it's time for us to end this seminar as well. So I want to thank all of the participants here. This was a fantastic symposium. I appreciate you offering to give your time to talk for 15 minutes and give a good overview of native plants. This has been recorded for those listening in and will be posted at some point. And that link will be available probably within multiple web pages, including Capital Naturalist, John Mcgee's site, and Seven Ben's Nursery as well. Thank you everyone for attending. Happy Earth Week.